So yes, this morning I'm delighted to welcome Catherine Allerton, who's a professor in the Department of Anthropology. Her current research explores experiences of exclusion, belonging and potential statelessness amongst the children of Indonesian and Filipino refugees and migrants in Malaysia. And this morning she's going to talk about her work and what it tells us about non-citizen childhoods. At the end, we should have time for some questions and we'll take those by the chat. So please do think of any that you have and put them in there at the end. But for now, I will hand straight over to Catherine. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Louise. Thanks so much. And thanks everyone for coming. So in my talk, what I'm really looking at is a question that's of very general relevance to lots of people in the world, which is the impact of migration on children or grandchildren of migrants. And in my work, I'm really interested in how particular kinds of national politics around migration intersect with and kind of shape the politics of childhood. So I'm particularly interested in how understandings of the nation and of citizenship influence perceptions of children and where they are considered to really belong or not belong. And my specific focus for exploring these questions is Sabah. Sabah is an East Malaysian state in the north of the island of Borneo. Malaysia as a whole, as a country, is economically extremely dependent on migrant workers, but this is particularly the case for Sabah. Sabah has about 44% of all the foreign workers in Malaysia. So almost half of all foreign workers in Malaysia are in Sabah. And it's been estimated that maybe, out of a population of roughly 2.9 million in Sabah, maybe 1 million of those are foreign workers. And in Sabah, these foreign workers originate from two regions with long historical connections to this kind of watery region of North Borneo. This is the southern Philippines. There were very long historical connections between the southern Philippines and Sabah, but the kind of numbers of people coming to Sabah really increased in the 1970s with the declaration of martial law in the Philippines and the Civil War. And then also Eastern Indonesia is a region where many rural migrants have come to work in various industries in Sabah. Now, some of these migrants, the parents or grandparents of the children I knew, came to Sabah over 40 years ago. They were meant to come temporarily. Some of them were refugees and were meant to go home. They never went home. They married in the state, they had children in the state, but the majority of them still have an irregular status. They may just have a temporary residency card if they were refugees, but this has to be renewed every year. And if they lose it, they slip into a kind of undocumented status. Or they may have been on a kind of legal visa, but then because of the actions of their employer, they also slipped into a irregular status. So according to Malaysian immigration regulations, foreign workers are supposed to be temporary, right? They're supposed to move in and out of the state as and when their labor is required. In reality, foreign workers in Sabah are very sticky. They've been there a long time. They've kind of formed families and settled in the state, but they're not supposed to form families. They're not supposed to marry. They're not supposed to have children. Now, anthropologist Nicole Constable has discussed the situation of foreign domestic workers in Hong Kong who become pregnant whilst they're working in the city. And she focuses particularly on this kind of issue of babies who are born out of place, right? And argues that in Hong Kong, you see migrant women continually treated just as these sort of temporary workers, but never as full persons, never as people who might have families. My work is less concerned with migrants themselves, constables working with these migrant women, but rather with what happens to those babies who the state might consider to have been born out of place, what happens to them as they grow up. And I'm really interested in this question of, are these children out of place? Why might they be out of place? So I did field work in Kota Kinabalu. Kota Kinabalu is the capital city of Sabah. This was a year of child-focused ethnography in children's homes, but mostly in these alternative learning centres where children receive education. And I used lots of kind of mixed methods in this fieldwork with lots of different kinds of children. It's very definitely the case that children of migrants and refugees in Kota Kinabalu are excluded, and they experience lots of everyday forms of exclusion. Non-citizen children are not allowed to go to Malaysian government schools. They're excluded from healthcare and other kinds of services. This applies even if children have a birth certificate, even if they were born in Sabah, which most of them were. So they have to try to find this so-called basic education, which is available in informal learning centres, but there aren't enough of these learning centres in the city. One of the other things that I really looked at in my research was also everyday bordering practices. What's interesting about these children is that although they're often described in Sabah as migrant children, most of them were born in the state. They've never crossed an international border, and yet their lives are kind of, these bordering practices of the state continually kind of impinge upon their lives. This little picture is a picture drawn by a boy. He was doing a thing called where you draw the road of your life, and you, at the beginning of the road, you're a baby, and at the end, you're as you are now. And along the road, you kind of draw little pictures of key things that have happened to you. And this is his father in jail for not having documents in jail in a detention center for a whole year. The picture on the right is a photograph that a child took, which I initially didn't really understand what this was a photo of. And it's basically a little shuttle boat that goes across the water into the mangrove swamps where many undocumented families live. So it's a kind of strange sort of little border between the world of people who are living together and who don't tend to have documents and who are afraid of the kind of immigration officials in the city, and then the kind of wider city. So in many respects, these are children who are out of place in the city. They are not supposed to exist. They're not allowed to go to school. They're not afforded healthcare or other services. Their movements and activities are restricted. And one of the motivations for my research was to uncover what this exclusion was like. I was very influenced by the work of Hannah Arendt. Arendt focused on the situation of stateless people in order to highlight the kind of emptiness of discourses around the idea of universal human rights. Right, so Arendt showed that in fact, there's no such thing as a universal human right. Rights depend on recognition by a state. And it's only that recognition that enables a person to be considered someone who has the right to have rights. Her argument was that the stateless didn't even have the right to have rights, because what kind of state was going to honor those rights for them? Now, the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child is the most widely signed and ratified UN convention. But it's interesting to think about Arendt's perspective on the stateless in relation to the Convention on the Rights of the Child, which includes the right to education. Children, if they're not recognised by the state in which they live, if they're not supposed to have been born there, if they're considered out of place, they don't have that right to have rights. They don't have the right to have child rights. So this is something that I'm writing about. This was something that I was very influenced by. But other aspects of my research have actually led me to think that this idea of children of migrants as being out of place is actually also quite problematic and doesn't really necessarily help us understand the kind of full extent of their situation. I was saying to Louise that I had to keep the cat out of the out of my study, but it's managed to break in. So one of my research methodologies was called Photos of My Life. And in this, what I did is I lent cameras to children and asked them to take images of their everyday life. Part of the problem with doing field work with undocumented children is that you have to be a little bit careful, to protect the safety of those children. You can't just sort of turn up wherever they are and see them. So there were a lot of aspects of children's lives that I couldn't always necessarily take part in, but these photographs enabled them to take pictures of their life and then describe them to me. So they returned their camera. I gave them copies of the images, but also asked them to describe these different images. And an extraordinary number of these images were of the places where children lived. For example, rumah kongsi. Rumah kongsi are long, often very dilapidated workers' housing, where migrant workers, mostly from Indonesia, live. They're usually attached to quarries, or they're near plantations, or they are near construction sites, and they're kind of given free by an employer, and workers live there with their children, with their families, and because of the ways in which workers from Eastern Indonesia were recruited over time, which was often that, say there was a man from the island of Solo who went to work in a timber factory, and then the boss of the timber factory needed more workers. The man from Solo would get his brothers and his friends and his neighbors in Solo to come. So you kind of end up with these rumah kongsi, which are actually often full of people of the same ethnicity, or people who originate even from the same village in Indonesia, or people who are related to one another. So rumah kongsi were, children took a lot of photographs of them, and of people in them, and of activities in them, little animals that they looked after in them. Children also took photographs of the settlements, the sort of village settlements where they lived in and around the city. These are often called squatter settlements. And for city planners, they're seen as very problematic places, right? And they often have to be demolished when the city authorities, when the state wants to sell land to developers, when there are new kinds of roads or projects. And so I initially, in my fieldwork, I did start visiting some of these places, but I was kind of thinking that these were, in some ways, problematic places. I was kind of adopting some of those perspectives of the sort of planners and of people who lived in KK and what they might have thought of them. But actually, again, children's photographs and their comments that they either verbally described to me what was in their photographs, or wrote on little sheets what these photographs were about, showed the kind of deep connection and everyday belonging that children had with these squatter settlements, the little stalls where their auntie worked selling all kinds of like little sweeties and cigarettes, the ways in which houses were transformed for particular kinds of wedding events, the sort of ways in which their families decorated these very, very temporary little structures in which they lived. So I don't have time to go into this in sort of a huge amount of detail. I suppose the key point is that it's a kind of outsider's perspective to think that these are children who are out of place. But in fact, the children I worked with didn't tend to see themselves as out of place. They saw themselves as very deeply connected and related to specific places in the city, not necessarily the places that were most well known to citizens in the city. These were often the places that were dismissed as problematic or unsightly by citizens. And what I found interesting is that these children's connection to place seems hard even for those citizens who are sympathetic to their plight to acknowledge. So, for example, there's a frequent assertion and assumption that Kota Kinabalu has thousands of street children, and that street children are often migrant children or are stateless children. And in fact, and I was ready and prepared to do fieldwork with street children. In fact, there are hardly any street children in KK. There are children living in these kinds of squatter settlements who are then somehow perceived by sympathetic helpers as being street children, whereas actually they're children who are of these places, who are of these very particular kinds of settlements. So one of the things that I want to acknowledge, whilst recognizing the very significant ways in which children of migrants and refugees in this context are excluded from education, from healthcare, from being able to move freely around the city, is also to acknowledge the ways in which they belong. I've mentioned place, I've mentioned housing. I'm also trying to write about how children's, the specific forms of language that children use are about their particular type of belonging to the city. The forms of work in which children engage are also particular kinds of belonging, because they might work in their auntie's stall or on a kind of stall in a market in the center of town. And these are actually, work is not something, is something kind of meaningful that they combine with learning, with education in learning centers. I've also been looking at religion and forms of mixed kinship, which are only possible in this city, which is this kind of cosmopolitan mixture of lots of different migrant groups. So you get really particular kinds of mixed ethnicities in the city that you don't find in these children's places of origin. And so, are children out of place or are they of place? The thing that children often said to me was, I'm a person from here. And this was often in response to me trying to ask very kind of like subtle questions about where their families came from, about what their ethnicity was, about, trying to kind of think about what their legal status might be. And some children just simply answered it by kind of dismissing these questions and saying, I am a person from here. And this is very interesting because in Sabah, actually, there's a whole discussion about kind of hierarchies of belonging and connection that connects with sort of Sabah's distinctive history, its relationship to the Malaysian Federation, what nativeness and indigenousness means in Sabah as opposed to on the kind of peninsula of Malaysia. So for these children to say, I'm a person from here is kind of quite a statement. But it also really, and this really relates to this is kind of the main thing that I want to say today, that terminology really matters. And that's what I have really been trying to be very, very careful with in everything that I write about these children and how I think about them. They're often described as migrant children, as refugee children. They're not migrants, most of them. Their parents or their grandparents were migrants. They, are they refugees if they were born in KK to refugees? In some ways they share a refugee status and they may have a card that says they're a refugee. But if we term them as refugees, what does that kind of naming do to how we see them? They're often described as stateless. One of the things I've looked at is how difficult it is to say whether they really are or are not legally stateless. And then there are other forms of terminology that we're familiar with that we use in the UK a lot, the second generation, the third generation. What does it mean to describe children as a kind of second generation? Are you still seeing them only as kind of defined by migration? Are you still seeing them in some way as migrants? It's even difficult to describe these children as Indonesian children or Filipino children. They might be born to Indonesian parents, but if they've never been in Indonesia, to what extent are they Indonesian or not? And this is why I think the idea of non-citizen childhoods is potentially really kind of fruitful and interesting. There are various people writing at the moment about this idea of non-citizenship, particularly Tendai Bloom, who's tried to kind of sort of uncover all the ways in which non-citizenship isn't just this kind of like abject sort of bare life status that's sometimes written about, but is an active relationship to a state. She's basically saying there have always been non-citizens as well as citizens. And so we always, in our kind of theorizations of citizenship, also need to think about non-citizenship. And non-citizens, they might be excluded from particular kinds of forms of belonging or particular kinds of services, but they are also in other kinds of ways sort of included and fight for particular kinds of things. So I'm sort of interested in, what does it mean then to talk about non-citizen children? Because citizenship means something very different for children than it does for adults. It doesn't entail the same kind of rights, and therefore non-citizenship is going to mean something very different for children as well. But the reason this term is kind of useful, I think, is because it encompasses children with lots of different legal statuses. In a sense, a lot of the literature on migration and undocumented peoples has become obsessed with illegality. Like, illegality is the thing that really makes a difference. And what I found in my research was that you could have children with an utterly undocumented status, with no form of documents. You could have children who maybe had a birth certificate and they'd lost it, and now they're at risk of statelessness. Then there were children who had a passport, who had a visa, who had gone out of the state and come back in and had a stamp in their passport. And then there were children who had migrated with their parents when they were babies. These children all had very different kinds of legal statuses, but they were all sharing a similar situation of exclusion from services in the state in which they live. They were all assumed to be kind of out of place in KK. So I think the term non-citizen child is useful because it encompasses all of those different kinds of legal statuses. And it acknowledges the significance of migration in shaping these children's lives, in shaping their family dynamics, possibly transnational relationships that they might have or might not have. But it doesn't assume that these are migrant children, right? Or that they are out of place in the place where they live. So I think I've run out of time. So I'm going to stop there and see if there are any questions. But what I really wanted to do is to kind of talk about, that way in which are children in this kind of context of place or out of place? What are the kind of tensions around that? And I think that this idea of non-citizen childhoods is helpful there for thinking about that.
Thank you very much, Catherine. That's really interesting. So anybody, if you have a question, please do pop it in the chat. And while you are typing them up, I will ask one of my own, which is, what's the kind of likely future for these children? Do you know what might happen to them?
Yeah, well, but then you also get into the sort of temporalities of fieldwork. So some of them I worked with in 2012 and they were 16. So, they're now in their 20s. And I know that most of them probably are still there. And what they've done is they've become foreign workers. They've moved into that category of foreign workers because the state is dependent on foreign workers. And what it's doing now is it's kind of it's sort of reproducing that class of underpaid foreign workers from children who were born in the state. There's a weird kind of apartheid-like system somehow. I know that a few Indonesian children who were maybe a little better off, or whose families had more active connections with Indonesia, have left Sabah. And what they've done is they've moved to cities in East Kalimantan, which is the province of Indonesia, which is just below Sabah. So that's kind of, so they've sort of become Indonesian, but they haven't gone back to their parents' origin villages, which is interesting.
Thank you. There's a question that's come in the chat. Elena Pinter says, really interesting presentation and really relevant to my work with children of asylum seekers in the UK. A clarification, you mentioned that children's movement was restricted, and I just wondered if you could clarify how they were excluded in this way.
Yes, thank you, Elena. So well, it's interesting how their movement is restricted. It's partly because the majority of the children I worked with are undocumented. And that in KK you get these kind of performances of bordering. You get these like spectacles of bordering where you'll get roadblocks set up and suddenly loads of police will be there, loads of immigration officials will be there, everyone on the buses has to get down, everyone's documents have to be checked. And so children would say to me often that they wanted to kind of move around, hang out in the city, walk about, jalan-jalan, but they couldn't because they didn't have a pass, they were undocumented. And so these kind of spectacles of bordering and checking documents inhibit their movements because their parents are worried about them being checked and then detained. What's kind of interesting is that when I talk to children who actually had been in one of these checking operations, usually children are let go because there's a sort of weird thing where Malaysian citizen children don't really get identity documents until they're 12. So if you look like you might be 12 or under, you're not expected to have documents anyway. So a lot of children said that they would just sort of slightly hide, or they'd stand behind someone, or they'd make themselves look very small. So it's most dangerous for teenagers, particularly teenage boys. And those are the kids who really want to move around the city and take risks, and then often sometimes do get detained. So their mobility is restricted because of the fear of document checking and the fear of detention as for being illegal immigrants. Yeah.
Was fear quite a big part of the experience of those children then as well?
That's such a good question, because I really thought it would be. And one of the very strange things about my fieldwork was how a lot of it was quite fun and a lot of it was quite funny. And I've written somewhere else about the sort of, there was a kind of dark humor about some of this stuff. I had a car that I, for the duration of my fieldwork, and in the sort of second half of my fieldwork, when I knew some children very well, they persuaded me sometimes to take them on trips. And what I found really interesting was how they loved those trips in the city, and how they constantly made jokes that made me terrified about immigration and police, and like, they're coming to get you. And they would sort of make very dark jokes with one another about, the officials are at your door, that's you gone to the red house. The red house is the immigration center, the detention center. So I think it really varied between children. I think some children were extremely fearful because their parents were extremely fearful, and they kind of picked that up. Other children lived in families where everyone was undocumented, and you couldn't just sit around at home or you'd never get anything done. So they kind of, they were less fearful. This was just an aspect of everyday life. That's why, in a way, that's why I've been talking about everyday bordering, everyday exclusion. It's just like, if you're a grandchild of Suluk refugees in this city, that's part of life, and you have to kind of get on with it. So I suppose in general, the Indonesian children were a bit more fearful than the Filipino origin children whose parents were and grandparents were refugees, and who couldn't imagine ever going back anywhere else. So it's kind of like, we're here, we just have to, this is just what you have to get used to.
And I know you worked in one particular place, but from other researchers, do you have a sense that this is a shared experience amongst similar children across the world? Or do you think it was very specific to that place?
I think there are aspects of their experiences which are very specific to Sabah and the very particular politics of ethnicity in this area of the world. One of the things about certain Indonesian origin and Filipino origin children is that they can really pass as locals. They speak the local language. They also really look similar. And that's what makes citizens very paranoid about the sort of existence of illegals. But I think there are definitely other aspects of experience which are very similar to those, for example, of migrant children from Myanmar in Thailand. I've read a lot about that. The Thai government also doesn't let children of migrants really go to school. It wants them to be educated in learning centres. It specifically doesn't want them to learn Thai songs or histories. It doesn't want them to feel attached to place. And I think that's so interesting. It makes it really explicit, the fact that it's about not acknowledging these children's connection to the place where they live.
Okay, we're just out of time, but one final question very quickly before we finish is about how much of the detention is performative but not fundamentally consequential for the children's future.
Oh, yeah.
What happens after detention?
Yes, that's a fantastic question, and a very I think that's very true. I did know children whose parents had been deported, but they were absolutely tiny minority. I think a lot of the detention is performative. I knew people who had eventually got out, A lot of the checking is performative. It makes people scared, but there are like set rates of what you need to pay to the policeman to let you go. And that's the irony of the situation, because the city and the state is dependent on these workers, you know, half of whom are undocumented. So you can't deport them all, because then your industries will fall apart. You know, there'll be nobody to work the oil palm plantations. And yet you also can't acknowledge their connection to place. You sort of, you know, it's this constant, you asked about fear, Louise. I think it is a sort of way in which, you know, people shouldn't feel at home or at play, that they're in the place that they're from. You know, they should constantly be made to feel like at any moment they might actually have to leave.